Hello, everyone. Happy Monday to all of you out there. Welcome, everyone who's watching on Rockfin. Shout out to everyone in the chat. I have a special guest tonight. His name is Caleb Maupin. He is a journalist, an author, and a political analyst. Welcome, Caleb.
Sure. Welcome. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on. This should be pretty good conversation.
I think so. I'm excited.
Awesome. So I want to start off with, could you explain to everyone why did you decide to become a journalist to begin with?
Well, I've always been very interested in politics and world events. These things were discussed in my household growing up. And I was part of Occupy Wall Street. And after that, I started attending international conferences and traveling the world. And I was giving kind of commentary and analysis on international television. And I had been doing some writing. I've had a number of articles published in different places. And I basically had the opportunity to start doing journalism and to, I had taken some journalism classes in college, and I had, written for college newspapers and, high school newspapers and such. And I had been, doing commentary articles for various online publications, and one thing led to another. And now I guess I'm proud to call myself a journalist.
Awesome. So I know that you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. So I want to get your opinion about everything that's going on in Afghanistan. How do you feel about Biden handling that situation? Do you feel that he handled it in a proper way, or do you feel that there are other things that he should have done?
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about Afghanistan, it is a Muslim country, but it's not technically part of the Middle East. It's actually Central Asia. The Middle East refers more to over closer to the Mediterranean. But we associate it with that because Afghanistan has been the site of so much U.S. war and destabilization and military occupation. And, it is an Islamic country, and it makes sense that in the American mind, it's considered to be part of the Middle East. It's quite interesting. For a long time, until about the 1970s, people used to refer to the Middle East as the Near East. And you want to talk about a European chauvinist term, it's near to what? Near to what exactly? But that's how people referred to it. They referred to the Near East as opposed to the Far East, like China. But Afghanistan, we have a situation there where, the USA has been occupying Afghanistan for 20 years. And the whole time the USA has been there, we haven't seen the country grow more stable. It hasn't grown more peaceful. We've seen a huge expansion in terrorist groups and their presence in the country. We've seen a huge expansion of the opium poppy fields and the drug gangs. A large percentage of the world's heroin, I think more than half, originates in the poppy fields of Afghanistan. 20 years, the country has been getting worse, and that instability has been very convenient for the United States because it has spilled over the border into Iran, which is a country I've been to many times. It's spilled north up into Russia, and it has spilled over the border into China. All three of those countries have had to deal with the flow of terrorist groups and drugs over their borders. And so I argued that the United States was not in Afghanistan to try and create peace or fight terrorism. The USA was in Afghanistan using it as a strategic epicenter of chaos. The idea was to use Afghanistan as a center of chaos and turmoil and have that turmoil go after three major geopolitical rivals of the United States, namely Iran, Russia, and China. And all three of those countries have suffered as a result of the chaos in Afghanistan. When I was in Iran, I saw, quite a few refugees from Afghanistan. There have been separatist groups. There are terrorist groups that go over the Afghan border, into Iran and conduct bombings and assassinations. In China, they've had such difficulties. Russia has a big problem with heroin gangs and Islamic separatist groups in Chechnya and elsewhere, many of which are operated in Afghanistan. And that was really the purpose. And this fits a pattern because if you look at Afghanistan, It's the same story as with Iraq. Is Iraq any more stable and prosperous since the United States invaded and overthrew the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government? What about Libya? Is Libya any more prosperous and stable? Prior to 2011 and the NATO bombing campaign, Libya actually had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. It was the most prosperous African country, the leading exporter of oil. They had actually built the world's largest irrigation system. They were greening the desert to grow their own food. Gaddafi was working with the African Union to create an independent African currency. And that was bombed and destroyed. And now Libya is a disaster. The USA has been intervening in Syria, trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And have conditions gotten better there? No, I mean, this fits a pattern. None of these countries benefit. And whenever it's time for us to go to war, the U.S. media plucks our heartstrings and tells us, oh, there's these people that are under attack, and they try to scare us with stories of weapons of mass destruction. And it's always this urgent situation. We have to intervene. And we tend to always find out afterwards that this, the reason we were being told we had to intervene was a pack of lies. The people we were supposedly going to rescue are worse off than they were before, tend to become refugees, flee their country, terrorist groups, drug gangs get stronger. This is the lie of U.S. interventionism. I would argue that these wars, they serve Wall Street, they serve the big major oil monopolies, they serve the military industrial complex. They don't serve the American people. We, the American people, are being left behind. We need a war on poverty at home. We need a war on crumbling infrastructure. We need jobs, education, and schools. We need universities, and we need better services for our population rather than in these criminal wars that we've been waging to benefit the big monopolies on Wall Street.
Agreed. And one of the things that I guess really irks my nerve is when people say, well, we have to be in these countries to protect the women. And I was talking about this a couple episodes ago. I showed everyone a picture of how women used to dress in Afghanistan before the US intervened. And now the laws are so much more stricter towards them. How do you feel when people make that comment? Because I saw a lot of people on Twitter saying that, a couple weeks ago, they were saying but we have to stay there because we have to protect the women.
Well, there's many ways to come at this. I think the most obvious thing is to just point to the sheer hypocrisy of the statement. What is one of the top allies of the United States in that region? One of the top purchasers of U.S. weapons, one of the top countries we get oil from, Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, just a couple years ago, changed the rules so that women could drive cars. They changed the law that women were allowed to drive cars. However, a number of the women who were protesting for the right to drive cars are on death row and could possibly have their heads removed in public executions for protesting for the right to drive cars. The USA loves the Saudi government. It's not a democracy in any conceivable way. It's an absolute autocracy. The king is the dictator. It doesn't even pretend to be a democracy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the majority of the country are guest worker slaves who are not citizens, have no rights, get tortured, get murdered all the time. They're there against their will. Often their passports have been confiscated. And the people from the Philippines, people from different parts of Africa who were held as slaves. Saudi Arabia is an atrocious human rights violating society, but the USA supplies them huge amounts of weapons, buys all kinds of oil, and is actually advising them right now in bombing Yemen and slaughtering the people of Yemen and destroying Yemen. So if we're concerned about women, why are we coddling the Saudi autocracy? Meanwhile, when I went to Iran, I used to joke that everything that Americans think is true about Iran is actually true about Saudi Arabia. Because in Iran, they have women who are generals in the military, brigadier generals. They have a very high representation of women in the Iranian parliament. The supreme leader of Iran has said that it is actually a crime against Islam to deprive a woman of the right to get an education. There's a huge amount of women's empowerment in Iran. Not that there aren't problems, obviously, comparatively speaking. Compared to the level of freedom that women have in the West, it's not where it should be. And, many Iranians, when you go there, are the first to tell you they have issues with human rights and that within their Islamic system, there are aspects of our Western view of things they don't approve of. But if you compare the status of women in Iran with the status of women in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar or in the United Arab Emirates or in Jordan or in so many of the countries the United States arms and supports throughout that region, it's night and day. And the same can be said for Syria. We're right now trying to overthrow the Syrian Arab Republic That's a country where you have Christians, Sunnis, Shias in government together. You have labor unions in the factories. You have, women in high-ranking positions. But that's a government we're trying to overthrow. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was far better to women than any of the U.S.-aligned regimes. So these claims are just loaded in hypocrisy to begin with. But then we can talk specifically about Afghanistan, because the conditions for women in Afghanistan have not improved in the 20 years of U.S. military occupation. The honor killings, the rape, the sale of women as property, that was all going on under the U.S. occupation. And the instability in the country opened up some of these horrendous things to happen. It was revealed that they were even children. There was a child trafficking that was going on throughout Afghanistan. It was kind of revealed that some of the U.S. allies were engaging in. There are horrendous things that have gone on. So if we were there to protect the women, we had 20 years to make life better for Afghanistan's women. We better get to it. 20 years is not a short time. You can't say, if we just had another 20 years. This is ridiculous. At the end of the day, the way to bring advances in human rights in any country is through economic development. When societies are underdeveloped, when they don't have the resources they need, when people are struggling to survive, that's when they become more rigid and authoritarian. But it's through economic development and jobs and economic opportunities and stability and education. That's how societies come to be more open and advanced in terms of human rights. We frame the human rights issue in the United States in a very moralist way. It's like all countries in the world should have the exact same level of human rights and freedom that we have in the United States right now. And if they don't, it's because they're bad. Well, it's not that simple. Countries all over the world are in different circumstances and they face different things. And the struggle to get to a society that can be as free and open as we are in the West is a struggle to get out of different conditions. And it's very assumptive. We didn't have the level of free speech that we have right now in the United States really until about the 1960s. Throughout U.S. history, we've had all kinds of restrictions. Women in the United States weren't granted the right to vote until the 1920s. So, there's a huge amount of weirdness, that we project the current circumstances of Western society onto the entire world and assume that the only reason they don't have exactly the same political system that we have, the same level of openness and freedom and human rights that we have, is simply because they're bad and they haven't made the moral choice. That's not understanding reality and how world politics works. It's simply not understanding these things, but it creates a great narrative if you want to start a war, right? These people are not being deprived of their rights. We better go invade them and bring them some rights. But the record doesn't show that.
Right. I'm glad that you brought up Saddam, because one of the things that people would often say to me is that, well, we had to get involved. We had to take him out because he was a horrible dictator, right? But I often argue with people that actually when we got involved and we removed Saddam, that actually gave way to ISIS. And I want to get your opinion on that. I felt like when he was in power, and I just make this clear to people, I'm not saying he was a good guy. I just want to make that very clear. But I felt like when he was in power, he was able to keep that in check in a way. But once we got involved and removed him, then all of a sudden, I felt like that gave power to ISIS. What's your opinion on that?
Well, you don't have to like Saddam Hussein. I've been to Iran, and the Iranians, they were invaded by Saddam Hussein, and they suffered horrendously, chemical weapons attacks, et cetera. They really had no love for Saddam Hussein. He killed a lot of Iranians. But that said, Saddam Hussein, he was a secular leader. He was from the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. And there were Christians in Iraq that were well represented in the government. There were Sunnis in Iraq, the Shias in Iraq were getting along. And it was a secular government with a Ba'athist Arab socialist, orientation. They were kind of aligned with the Soviet Union, et cetera. Saddam Hussein, after 9/11, was one of the first people to step up and come to the aid of the United States and say, wow. And why was that? Well, Saddam Hussein's been fighting those folks for years. Al-Qaeda, the Wahhabi terrorists who want to kind of have us political system similar to Saudi Arabia's have been Saddam Hussein's biggest enemies. Gaddafi, after 9/11, he even offered to torture people for the United States because he'd been fighting al-Qaeda type people for years, right? Assad, he stepped up and he said, yeah, I've been fighting these people for years, right? The people who carried out 9/11, the Wahhabi terrorist kind of groups, right, that follow an interpretation of Islam that is promoted by Saudi Arabia. It's called Wahhabism. That particular interpretation of Islam, that's promoted by the biggest enemies of these secular nationalist and socialist governments in the Middle East. They're the ones who practice, who have been fighting the hardest against that perspective. Meanwhile, it's Saudi Arabia that spreads that ideology around the world, whether it's into India with the Deobandi schools. It was Saudi Arabia that brought that ideology to Afghanistan, where they were being supported by the United States to fight the Soviet Union. Wahhabism. That's the ISIS ideology. That's the ISIS-K ideology. That's the Al-Qaeda ideology. That's the Al-Nusra ideology. And that's the folks that commit these horrendous terrorist attacks. Meanwhile, the governments that we seem to be targeting throughout the Middle East tend to be the governments that are fighting against those folks. I say we've had 20 years of a war on terror, but it hasn't really been a war on terror. It's been a war against the enemies of the terrorists. We've been acting like Al-Qaeda's Air Force. Al-Qaeda was trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, we did it for him. Al-Qaeda was trying to get rid of Gaddafi. We did it for him. Al-Qaeda was trying to get rid of the Syrian government, and we've been trying our hardest, it seems, to do it for him. Go all over the world. Where is Al-Qaeda not on the same side as the U.S. government? In Yemen, the U.S. government is backing Saudi Arabia to fight against the Yemeni people. Well, Al-Qaeda is also in Yemen, fighting on the side of Saudi Arabia against the Yemeni people. In Syria, Al-Qaeda is fighting against the Syrian government. The United States is fighting against the Syrian government. I mean, we're seeing a pattern here. So people who say, well, Saddam Hussein was so bad. I mean, Saddam Hussein was Al-Qaeda's enemy. I mean, I certainly know for a fact he was a bad leader, but he was Al-Qaeda's enemy. He wasn't Al-Qaeda's ally, and removing him created a vacuum through which these, vicious terrorists that are very much a threat to the United States could emerge. I mean, the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report were kept from us for how many decades? It wasn't until 2016 they were revealed that, that the connections of the hijackers on 9/11 high up into the Saudi government. I mean, that was a reality there. The bin Laden family are the wealthiest people in Saudi Arabia, one of the wealthiest. They have a state monopoly on construction. And it seems like our leaders are more concerned with making sure that big oil monopolies and their friends in Saudi Arabia maintain economic dominance than they are about keeping us safe. Because instead of fighting a war on terror, they're fighting a war against the enemies of the terrorists. And that makes no real sense.
Agreed. What are some of the common misconceptions you think that Americans may have about the Middle East, having been there multiple times yourself?
Well, I went to Iran and I went to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I went there several times. And I tell people that, every time I went there, I thought I knew it better. And then the next time I went, I learned something that I didn't know before. And that we should be weary of the image that we get of these countries, and the assumption that these countries are primitive and backward. The assumption that the people there are not enlightened and engaged. Look, they've done polls that a very large percentage of the U.S. public can't find their own country on a map. You know that? I mean, a large percentage of us, we can't find our own country on a map. We can't find the countries we're bombing on a map. Well, you go to the Middle East, you go to Iran, you go to Syria. You go to Iraq, the kids there, they may have different perspectives and they may, be very religious or whatever, but they can certainly find their own country on a map. And that, we really need to rethink, we have this notion that, in Iran, yes, the young people are brought up to support the Islamic Republic and such. And we see images of Iranian young people, saluting the supreme leader or whatnot. We say, well, they're brainwashed. They're so brainwashed. Well, they can find their country on a map and our young people cannot. So, you have to ask yourself, I mean, we're in the West, we're thinking for ourselves, right? That's the big thing in the United States. People think for themselves. That's the main, you talk to people who watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox, and they watch that and then they can't watch alternative media because they're too busy thinking for themselves, right? Oh, I think for myself, I can't watch that. That's the excuse you get. Well, it seems like in a lot of ways our think for ourselves, think for yourself has become a euphemism for not thinking at all. And around the world, there are people that are far more engaged when it comes to things like politics, when it comes to knowing the history of their country, understanding how the world works. And that's a very big misconception, I think, that we would have. Another thing is that I think that we think that Iranians want to kill us, that they're all out to get us and all of that. And that's not the case. They do obviously have anger about the coups and the sanctions and the attempts to overthrow their government and such. But at the same time, I was an American there. I was treated with nothing but kindness. I went to church on Sunday morning in Iran. Every Sunday I would go to an Armenian Christian church in Tehran. And I've got to say that Christians in Iran are treated far better than Muslims in America are treated. I mean, nobody spit on us, nobody harassed us. They actually have a special rule. In Iran, alcohol is illegal because it's a violation of the Islamic rules. But in the churches, those laws don't apply. And so inside the church, you can have communion wine. Inside the church, women don't have to wear a headscarf. And within the church walls, you can just do whatever you need to do. None of the Islamic laws apply within the church grounds. There's like a wall around the church, and they're allowed to practice their faith. There was a point at one point there was an American pastor who was burning the Quran, and many Iranians were angry about this. So they actually, to make sure that no one retaliated against this church in central Tehran, they sent military people to guard this church to make sure there was no retaliation against Christians, to just protect this church in central Tehran, to see that. But the other thing that was very important is, one of the times I went to Iran, I actually accompanied a mission of the Red Crescent Society, which, that's the Red Cross, it's the Red Crescent in the Middle East. And I went with them, and we attempted to deliver humanitarian aid to Yemen. Yemen is suffering. There's a blockade around it. Saudi Arabia is bombing it. A large number, tens of thousands of civilians have died in this ongoing war. And I was on a ship, with Iranian doctors and Iranian medical volunteers trying to bring medical aid to Yemen. There was a German citizen on the ship. There was a French citizen on the ship. The rest of the ship were all Iranians. And we were trying to bring medical aid to the people of Yemen. And the reason that we weren't able to deliver the aid was because on the day we were supposed to arrive at the port of Hodeidah, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia bombed the port 8 times in a single day. 8 times on a single day, they bombed the port to prevent us from bringing medical aid. That is a war crime. It is a war crime to bomb a port, to block medical aid from being delivered. Israeli media and Saudi media tried to claim there were weapons on our ship, that we were delivering weapons. However, we docked in the African country of Djibouti and unloaded our medical supplies for the UN. And the UN Relief Works Agency saw with their own eyes, we were not delivering weapons. We were delivering flour and medicine and food and medical supplies. It was not a military mission by any means. It was part of the Red Crescent Society. And the fact that they bombed this port 8 times in a single day to keep us from delivering that humanitarian aid, and then 2 days later bombed the medical university. The medical university in the town of Hodeidah, which is where some of the medical students that they were attending, that's who we would have brought this aid to. They bombed the medical university and killed 32 medical students just to retaliate. How dare they try to get this medical aid from Iran? The Saudi regime are vicious murderers, and our policy in the Middle East for decades and decades and decades has been to arm vicious murderers, to back U.S. foreign policy. Whether it's in Afghanistan, where the Taliban was basically armed by the United States to fight against the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and their Soviet allies. Whether it's in Syria, where we've been arming these extremist groups out of which ISIS emerged. Right, we have this policy of arming terrorists and extremists because we think it will advance our goals. And at the end of the day, it's not good for the United States. At the end of the day, it ends up hurting us in the long run. It makes the world less safe. And we've been doing the same thing in Central America. Nicaragua right? The Contras that were funded by the US government, they're the people that brought cocaine and crack to the United States, right? We were arming these people to fight against a socialist government in Nicaragua. And throughout that region, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, they've all had big problems with drug gangs ever since. Why? Because we were arming these drug dealers and allowing them to bring drugs into the United States to enrich themselves, to have high-tech, expensive U.S.-made weapons. And now that whole region has just been devastated. Ever since the 1980s, when this policy was in effect, that region has just been devastated. What is the body count of the U.S. arming these terrorist groups, right? If you think about how many people in Central America have had to flee from their homes, how many people in the Middle East have been killed by these extremist groups, we're always given this big number, right? Oh, you can't be a communist because communism killed a million people. What is the body count of all the people that have been killed by the U.S. government arming these terrorist groups and extremist groups, enabling them to become drug dealers? These things don't get discussed, but this is the reality. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a U.S. foreign policy strategist during the Carter administration. His daughter is Mika on Morning Joe. If you ever watch Morning Joe, that's his daughter. And his strategy for dominating Eurasia and dominating that side of the world was, he said in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he said, quote, "Keep the barbarians killing each other." And that the strategy was to pour as many weapons and as much, covert support into Eurasia as possible, and keep the people of the Middle East and Central Asia killing each other, so that the United States could maintain economic and geopolitical dominance. That is a maniacally evil strategy. And that is largely been the strategy. And that's why, when you look at the history of Russia, when you look at the history of China, there is a lot of admiration for leaders who have unified the area, right? Ivan the Terrible is widely loved in Russia because he brought the territory of Russia together under one government. The Qing dynasty is widely loved in China because they brought the territory of China together, right? In areas where you have a big landmass, you don't have access to the ocean as much. The territories are better when they are together, when they are working together, when they're trading with each other. That's when you have economic development. People are raised out of poverty. And that's why, for example, Stalin is still widely admired in Russia, because he unified that area, defeated the Nazi invaders. That's why the Chinese Communist Party is very, very widely respected in China. And that's why the issue of Taiwan and Hong Kong and the Uyghur regions and Tibet is very important, because they remember what it was like when they were divided, when there were different factions and all of that. But when they became unified, when these vast landmass territories became unified, that laid the basis for economic development and bringing electricity and wiping out illiteracy and raising people out of poverty. And that's something we need to understand. When we talk about imperialism and empire, it has a different connotation in those regions because of the history and how people like Brzezinski and the British Empire in the 1800s have been able to weaken these parts of the world by playing the many different tribal and ethnic groups against each other.
Yeah. There was a show that I saw, I believe this was like 2 years ago. It was on, I want to say Hulu, and it was called The Looming Tower. And it was about basically like I guess, pseudo documentary about what happened before 9/11. And this was something that I had never seen. And after I finished that show, I remember saying to myself that everything that I thought I knew, it just went out the window. Because what I didn't understand how the United States government, how we were complicit, the things that we did beforehand that prompted like these attacks. And seeing children, just innocent children, being killed by like our airstrikes, it just it made me like really understand why people, so many people from other countries sometimes are so angry at us. And I just couldn't get that image out of my head. And then to find out that we had an opportunity, or the United States government had an opportunity to intervene beforehand and could have prevented like those attacks. It just really kind of woke me up in a way. And I wanted to get your opinion about 9/11 as well.
Sure. I mean, look, I mean, we all have questions. I mean, there's plenty of questions that can be raised about the official story, but putting those questions aside for the moment, when it comes to 9/11, it's, the official story is that we were attacked by Al Qaeda. And as I've said so many times, Al Qaeda is a force that tends to be aligned with the United States around the world. And it's a force that all the governments the United States is putting sanctions on, like the Iranian government, like the government of Syria, like the previously existing government in Libya, or like Saddam Hussein's government, that they've been fighting with. And the U.S. government has aligned itself throughout the world with these Wahhabi terrorists and extremists. And it appears that these crazy folks that we were arming and supporting turned around and attacked. They bit the hand that feeds them. And I mean, I guess, maybe that's what happens, right? I mean, if, they talk about, if dog fighters or whatever, right? If you're training a wild dog to be as vicious as possible, you might get it to be so vicious and crazy that when it might bite you. And it seems like that's what happened. And that this policy of arming Wahhabi terrorists and extremists, it goes back to the Cold War, because Afghanistan, they were lifting people out of poverty. They had literacy campaigns to teach women to read. Women were voting. I mean, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was taking real strides in the late 70s and early 80s to help the population. And we saw that as Soviet communism, or as something we had to stop because they were aligned with the Soviet Union. Now, Brzezinski, who I mentioned before, the foreign policy strategist, who's really so much is the Dr. Evil of so much of U.S. foreign policy, is this guy Zbigniew Brzezinski. Obama studied under him at Columbia University, and he's a very, very influential person. And often it's learning about these people that are in the back room. That's where you can really learn how decisions are made. The politicians, they're very carefully, vetted. They have the perfect image for TV. They're almost actors. But it's those backroom people that we never get to vote for. Samantha Power, Ben Rhodes, people like that. Cass Sunstein. They're the folks that when you study their careers and their writings, you can start to learn the kind of decisions that are made and how they're made. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was one of these folks, and he engineered this strategy of arming terrorists and extremists throughout the Middle East to fight against the Soviet Union. And the result of that policy has just been more death, more destruction, more suffering. And if we look at that, I come from a small town in Ohio. It's where I grew up. And a lot of my classmates have been to Afghanistan. And a lot of people I went to school with fought in Afghanistan. Yeah. I remember there was somebody I went to school with, and I don't know what the rules are around the military and social media, because I hope she didn't get in any trouble. But one day she was just unloading on her Facebook about how much she hated being there, how the people didn't want her there in Afghanistan. She was miserable. She hated it. She wished she'd never signed up for the military. And all kinds of people, that I went to school with, I went to high school with back in Ohio, were messaging me, oh my God, take a look at her Facebook. And she was just unloading there and telling people how much of a waste of time the U.S. war in Afghanistan was. And I mean, how are we as Americans benefiting from this? What have we gotten out of 20 years? So many lives lost. And that doesn't include the people who've lost arms and lost legs, and come home with PTSD. There's a friend of mine who runs a school for truck drivers, right? He runs a school to help people get their truck driving license, right? And there's a lot of former military folks who went to his truck driving school in order to get their certification. And he said, after those Paris ISIS attacks, there were a few of them that were afraid to leave their house because of PTSD, because they had the memory of driving a truck in Iraq or driving a truck in Afghanistan, being afraid of being blown up by terrorists or something. And when the Paris attacks happened, they became overwhelmed in a mental health crisis with fear, wouldn't leave their homes. And that's the trauma of war. War is a really ugly thing. We get pumped up with these action movies. We think war is so romantic and all that. And it is really not. War is a very, very ugly thing. It is an extremely ugly thing. And part of the problem is that largely, when people have been through something as horrendous as a war, it's too overwhelming. They can't even really bring themselves to fully remember it. And a lot of the memories of war, a lot of the depictions of war in movies are split, depictions. They're the memories that people have kind of edited, the memories that they like to tell themselves about, but yet deeper in their subconscious, they have the painful, burning memories of fearing for their lives, of the horrendous things that they saw. War is not good. War is not a good thing. War is not a good thing at all. And we're certainly not benefiting from these wars as Americans. I'll tell you that much.
Agreed. I want to transition into the Center for Political Innovation. I'm going to share my screen because this was really interesting. And this is more along the lines of when I think about how we can help our country, this is more so what I'm thinking about instead of electoral politics because I've given up on the Democratic Party. Um, but you have a 4-point plan to rescue the country. And I was wondering if you can touch on these a little bit. I'll start with the first one, which is a mass mobilization to rebuild the country.
Well, right now, the country is falling apart. I mean, our water is not being properly purified. Our roads are crumbling. The power plants are crumbling. I mean, there's many aspects of the country. Schools are falling down. And right now, with an economic crisis, with many young people unemployed since the pandemic, or maybe they are employed, but they're making very, very low wages in a short-term service sector job. We need a new works progress administration, something like what Roosevelt did, to hire the millions of unemployed at a decent wage and put them to work rebuilding the country, pave the roads. Let's build high-speed railway throughout the United States. Let's bring high-speed accessible Wi-Fi to the entire country. This is what lays the basis for a vibrant, strong economy, is when you have infrastructure, when you have paved roads, when you have decent power plants and electrical access. That lays the basis for a strong economy. And right now, the infrastructure of the United States, especially in the heartland, right, is just falling apart. But even here in New York City, this is supposedly the richest city in the world, the capital of capitalism. Our subway system is an embarrassment. I mean, compare it to the subways of any other major country. It's an embarrassment. We don't have public transportation access. There are so many things that could be done. And rather than spending money on wars and death and destruction, maybe we should be mobilizing young people in a project to rebuild the country. Assemble some of the smartest minds, get a brain trust together and have them develop a 5-year plan to reinvent the United States economically and just build a whole new country for the people. I think that should be the priority of any government.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, Caleb, I challenge you on public transportation. Come take the T in Boston. Come on.
Is it bad?
Oh my God, Caleb, is terrible. It's
Oh,
terrible. That's why a lot of people still drive to work, even though they could take like the bus or the subway. We call them both the T. But every time I go back and visit New York, I'm like, oh my God, at least I know the train is coming.
yeah. Indeed. I mean, a lot of parts of the country, the subway like shuts down at midnight. It doesn't even go 24 hours. So
Yep. The second point you have here, public ownership of natural resources. I want to hear a little bit about this as well.
Well, see, our natural resources are the source of a great amount of wealth in the United States, and especially now with hydraulic fracking. There are parts of the country that are economically devastated that are making huge amounts of profits for Wall Street oil companies. I mean, you go throughout the United States, there are people in places like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin where they are getting poorer. Their living standard is going down. But these Wall Street corporations that have a certificate of ownership are getting richer and richer and richer off their natural resources. And that's not just natural gas, that's and oil, that's coal, that's timber. That this is a very wealthy country. And why is it that the wealth, the natural wealth of the country that nobody put there, right? I mean, you or I, we didn't put it there, we didn't make it. It's just the natural wealth of the country. Why should that be monopolized by private companies? And furthermore, with an environmental situation as we're facing with climate change and all that, why should we trust for-profit institutions to manage these resources? They're clearly not going to do it in a sustainable way. Wouldn't it be better if the natural resources were declared to be the property of all Americans? Don't we all have the right to our natural resources? Doesn't the coal and the timber and the natural gas and the oil of the United States belong to everyone who lives here? And shouldn't it be managed in a way that is sustainable for the benefit of the country? Shouldn't the profits from our oil go into the public budget to pay for things like schools and hospitals and roads and power plants, et cetera? I mean, if we actually had the profits from our natural resources going into the public budget, we wouldn't have an issue with a budget deficit. We wouldn't be having austerity and cutbacks in the economy. The government would have plenty of money. These big oil monopolies make lots and lots of money off of the wealth of the country, whereas the country is getting poorer. And public control of natural resources, public ownership of natural resources is a way to resolve that, which many countries around the world have public control of their natural resources and public ownership. And I think we should take that move here.
Awesome. Number three, and I like this one too, of course. Number three is public control of banking. And I've heard this come up a couple of times over the past couple years. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I come from like a left wing, radical, Marxist kind of perspective. But, if that's too radical for you, I would encourage you to go read the Bible, or read the Torah, or read the Quran, because all of those texts and every major religion forbids the lending of money at interest. And there's a reason for that, because when someone is lending money at interest, they are making money simply by having money. They're not producing anything. They're just giving somebody money, and then they're getting money back with interest. They're making money by having money. And when you have a group of people who can make money by having money, pretty soon they have far, far more money than everyone else. And as a result, pretty soon the government is in debt to them. And pretty soon all of society is in debt to them. And you get a creditor class that is wealthier than everyone else. And that's a problem. I tell people, again, if you don't want to read Karl Marx, you don't want to read radical stuff, go read the U.S. Constitution. Because the U.S. Constitution says that only the federal government can print money, all right, that no other entity can. But yet we've passed that on to the Federal Reserve. And for every dollar that is printed, we get further in debt. We are getting in debt to print more money, to pay off the debt, to get in more debt. I mean, it's this cycle where the banks are ripping off the country. Well, I would argue that instead of having private banks that we should have at a local, state, and federal level, we should have the lending of money be carried out in the interest of the country overall. We should have a state monopoly on the lending of money. The government should print the money, as the Constitution says, not the Federal Reserve Bank. And with that, it can be done strategically, right? If someone wants to start a business, instead of going to a private bank and the private banker determines whether it'll be profitable to lend the money, they should have to make the case to the community that their business will benefit the community, right? I mean, if somebody wants to get a mortgage for a house, that the community has to decide if it would be beneficial to lend this person that. And when they then pay off the interest, it wouldn't go to private individuals. It would go back into the public budget, taking the burden off the taxpayer. So we have more money to pay for schools and hospitals and education and such. The lending of money should be done strategically as part of an overall economic plan for the benefit of the country, not simply so that a private creditor class can make money. And that's the idea. And it's a pretty unoriginal idea. It's not something I thought of, and it was like my original brilliant concept. Throughout history, people have warned about the danger of private bankers. I believe Thomas Jefferson said that private bankers are more dangerous than armies to the United States. So this is pretty basic, and I would call for public control of banking and public control of the financial sector.
Awesome. Roger Meadows sent a super chat that said, I live in Nassau City, New York State budget, which is an exec budget. Governor has power of purse. Legislature has veto power. Looking to get into the 2022 budget pub bank legislation, and New York builds Public Renewable Act.
Sure. Well, after the financial crisis in 2008, there was, some articles in the New York Times and elsewhere that talked about the need for a public bank that would be an alternative to private banks. I know AOC has talked about the need for postal banking, letting people use the post office as their bank, et cetera. But I'm calling for something different than that. I'm saying we need to abolish private banking. I think that the lending of money at interest should be exclusively done by the state. Rather than having private corporations at all, rather than having credit card rip-off schemes or mortgage lenders, we need state control of the purse string. So the state is directing economic activity on behalf of the community, rather than having private corporations just, continue to enrich themselves.
Well said. I'm going to move on to the fourth point. Share my screen. All right. An economic bill of rights. So it says, like, in his final State of Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed an economic bill of rights. The right to a job, housing, education, and healthcare must be added to the U.S. Constitution. Yes, I would love to hear more about this.
Yeah, well, in his last State of the Union speech, Franklin Delano Roosevelt called for a new economic Bill of Rights. And you can watch the video of it. I mean, he said that Americans need the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to have a business environment free from unfair competition and monopolies, an economic Bill of Rights to protect the country. And Roosevelt argued that it was necessary to have these things in order to preserve democracy. He said that hungry stomachs are what dictatorships are made of, and that when people are hungry and desperate, that's where you get these kind of brutal regimes like the Nazis, who Roosevelt had been mobilizing the country to defeat in the Second World War. And so his final State of the Union address called for an economic Bill of Rights. And I think we ought to implement an economic Bill of Rights in the United States. The right to a job, the right to housing, the right to education is just as essential as the right to free speech, the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc.
Good point. We have another question about public banking from Danny. Thanks so much for the super chat. Would public banking include dismantling the New York Stock Exchange? And if so, would people's investments be converted to savings accounts or taxed away, or what?
Well, I think there could be a role for some entity like the New York Stock Exchange to exist, right? I mean, the way the stock exchange works is that you have, publicly chartered corporations that people are able to buy stocks in, and then they get a share of the profits, et cetera. And you could have that, I think, in such a context. But I do think that when it comes to the entities that lend money, banking institutions, I think they should be taken under public ownership, right? And obviously there would have to be some kind of compensation that would be arranged for those who have shares of these banks. They would have to, they would have to be paid for their shares, and there would have to be some kind of public compensation that would go. I mean, just like when any other entity would be seized by the state under eminent domain under the U.S. Constitution, it's understood that the individual, has to be paid for it, right? The government can't just come in and take it, right? People should be compensated for what they already have. But as we would move toward a public banking system, that would involve, the abolition of private banking. But other corporations would exist on the New York Stock Exchange, I'm sure, manufacturers, et cetera. And I would think, if you look at the socialist countries of the world, China has a stock market, Vietnam has a stock market. Having foreign investment, having an entity where people can have stock and have joint ownership in corporations, I think that could be beneficial to the country overall. But that should be the question: is it beneficial to the country overall? Right? We've gotten away from this notion of statecraft, right? If you're a parent, right, and your child comes to school in the wintertime without warm clothes, you can be charged and arrested. And what would you be arrested for, right? It's called criminal neglect, right? You're not fulfilling your duty. As a parent, you have an obligation to your child to make sure that they're not cold in the wintertime. If your child is not eating properly, again, you have an obligation as a parent to feed your child. Well, I would say that the government of the United States at this time is guilty of criminal neglect. Our water's not being purified. Our roads are falling apart. The population is not being properly educated. Our educational system is in shambles. The government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect. And they have this notion that the government is best, that governs least, keep the government hands off. But if you look throughout the history of the world, the greatest successes have always been when there was another mindset, when there was a feeling of what you can call statecraft. The notion that the government has an obligation to improve society. You talk about throughout the Dark Ages in Europe, when there was just, there was primitive poverty and such. Things started to change in the Renaissance, when there started to be a notion of statecraft, when there started to be a feeling that the government had an obligation to improve the lives of the population. During the Dark Ages, people existed to serve those above them. The peasantry and the serfs existed to serve the landowners. The commoners existed to serve the king. But things started to change when there started to be an understanding that it goes both ways, that the state and the leaders have an obligation to serve the people. If you read the Treaty of Westphalia, that was kind of a change. And that's how we got the music of Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. That's how we got the works of William Shakespeare. That's how we got the Sistine Chapel and the beautiful, the beautiful works of art that we've seen. That's how we got so many great advances in mathematics and science. It was a notion that governments have a responsibility to govern. They are obligated to serve the people, and that has been kind of lost. And what's interesting is that among the founders of the United States, there was a big disagreement about this. Thomas Jefferson was very much a libertarian. He talked about the yeoman and the small farmer and government's hands off. But Alexander Hamilton had a different conception. He argued that the United States needed to have a national bank. It needed to build lighthouses to facilitate foreign trade. And Alexander Hamilton, interestingly, not only was he very opposed to slavery, but he understood that the United States, it would be in the interest of the United States to recognize the Haitian government. When the Haitian slaves broke their chains and set up a government of their own in Haiti, Alexander Hamilton urged the United States to confer recognition on that revolutionary government. Now, he was outvoted. They didn't want to hear it. But that was a very different conception. Thomas Jefferson, he didn't see things that way. And that there were debates among the founders of the United States about what should the role of the state be. But overall, I feel the government does have an obligation to serve the people. And this notion that we should just, government hands off, it's always better if a private corporation does this. This has gotten so far out of control in the United States. Private prisons. Are you kidding me? Who thought of this? It's better to have a private company run a prison, because then the more people that are locked up, the more profits they make. What could possibly go wrong with that? Right? I mean, private military contractors. Why have an army fight our wars? We could have a private company with guns that gets paid for every person that we send overseas to go in a war. What could possibly go wrong with that? We have gotten so addicted to the economic theories of neoliberalism. You talk about Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and Alan Greenspan, and this is sociopathic economics. This is politicized sociopathy. It's the idea that no one has any obligation to anybody else. You're just an atomized individual on your own, and that's just not the reality of human beings historically. We are collective creatures. Human beings are collective creatures. We have always come together to build societies, and human beings are unlike any other species. Ants have been making their ant farms the same way for millions of years. Beavers have been building their beaver dams the same way for millions of years. But in just about 7,000 to 8,000 years, we've gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. It's amazing what human beings can do. We are a very, very special species, I must say. And we're special because of our ability to work together and to coordinate our activities. The problem is right now we are working together and coordinating our activities to make profits for a small group of owners. Well, I would argue we could organize our economy and our collectivism and our collective endeavors more rationally for the benefit of society with a long-term vision, and we could have good results. And look at China. In the past 60 years, China has gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a huge superpower. Millions raised up from poverty. The whole world is kind of marveling at their economic achievements. Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they don't buy into this everyone for themselves, the government has no obligation. They don't buy into that at all. There is a collective vision. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. There's definitely private companies there. There's definitely wealth inequality, but it's not a free market economy. They've gotten beyond this idea that the government should just keep its hands off. They've mobilized the population, and it has had very good results for the country.
I want to hear about your political ideology, because those of us at FHL, we are, I guess you would say, we are not, shunning electoral politics, but we just feel like there is too much focus on electoral politics instead of the things that we can do ourselves, such as direct action and mutual aid, volunteering, helping out within our community, so that we don't have to wait on elected officials to try to do these things or say they're going to do these things and then get in and not do it. We feel that the way it's going right now, it's 80% electoral politics, 20% direct action. We feel that should be flipped. And I personally feel like if you are going to vote, to do so third party. There are more socialists that are running for local elections and are winning. Look at India Walton in Buffalo. Shama Sawant is probably most popular one. I want to hear about your opinion about politics and where do you feel you stand today?
Well, in terms of what you referred to about voting versus direct action, the most important thing people can do now is build communities of solidarity. We need to start coming together and build political infrastructure. There need to be organizations and networks of Americans who take care of each other, feed each other, provide services to each other, but also embrace, the understanding of politics. Stop assuming that the people in the government are smarter than we are, and we just can't possibly understand it. They have degrees and all that. No, they're failing. We need to take history into our own hands. We need to build communities of solidarity, unemployment associations, mutual aid. The labor movement is very, very important. And on top of that, we need to do political education. The Center for Political Innovation that I'm part of is dedicated to political education. It's dedicated to raising consciousness and teaching people about socialism and Marxism and kind of countering the mythology and the confusion that we're all given in US society. We're just loaded with propaganda. And it's building those kind of structures that could lay the basis for candidates or political figures to emerge that would be worth supporting. Right? Because, AOC, I've met her a couple times. She seems like a nice person, but she's really been a huge disappointment. But why is that? Why has she been such a huge disappointment? What would she gain? There's no mass organization of people, that she would have to make a deal with in order to get reelected. There's no political infrastructure that she would need to negotiate with, right? The reason that Roosevelt passed his progressive reforms during the 1930s, that was because there was a mass movement. The Communist Party of the United States built unemployment councils, et cetera. Why is it that, that they have a breakfast program in schools? That's because Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party were doing it themselves, and they were doing a breakfast program. And at the same time they were feeding the kids, they were teaching them revolutionary ideology. And so Richard Nixon, despite being a conservative, panicked, and so they set up the breakfast program in schools, right? The way you get reforms, voting and electing people is part of the process, sure, but the main thing is building structures, building communities. And this goes against some of the notions that we have in terms of protest nowadays also, because a lot of times, we're all about hashtag revolution, right? The hashtag goes out, we all assemble at the place and we get our anger out, but we don't build anything, right? And that's what's missing, right? And political figures and protest movements and all that depend on structures. We need to build structures. We need to not be atomized individuals. We need there to be communities of solidarity centered around socialist principles and teachings. That's going to be the basis of things changing. Until new structures start to emerge, we're not really going to see change. Structures must be constructed.
Agreed. Do you think when we think about third parties, so this is coming around again. Andrew Yang said he's going to start a third party. There's no name of the party or no plan right now, but he said he's going to start one. So there's that. When you think about third parties such as the Green Party, moving for a People's Party, I kind of feel like if MPP and Green Party came together, they may be more successful if we find a way to come together instead of us being like divided. Or do you feel like maybe we should just need another third party option? And I kind of feel like this goes hand in hand with ranked choice voting as well, because I feel like in order for them to do well, we need to have ranked choice voting. But I want to get your take on third parties, yay or nay, and why not?
Well, I think every presidential vote I've ever cast as an adult has been for a third party. And I'm largely sympathetic to third parties. And the way our two-party system is structured is completely absurd, and it narrows down political discourse in the United States. And that said, there are some Democrats that I like. For example, Charles Barron, who's in the city council here in New York City, former Black Panther. He's got a picture of Lenin in his office. He was friends with Gaddafi. And he has always been at every protest against school closings and against police brutality for many decades. And he may happen to be a Democrat, but I would vote for Charles Barron. I campaigned for him a few years ago. I don't campaign for people now as I'm a journalist. That's something I can't do. But when I was an activist, I campaigned for Charles Barron, and I find him very, very awesome. And Cynthia McKinney was a Democrat for many years, and I've met Cynthia McKinney before, and she's pretty awesome. And so there are people within the Democratic Party who maybe on a local level or whatever are able to be Democrats and get good things done. And I don't buy into this logic that we should just, oh, you're a Democrat, you're no good. I don't go that far. But that said, yes, the third parties are far more hopeful. I mean, and yeah, the more that we can be united, the better. The more that people, of progressive vision can be working together and cooperating with each other, the better. I like the People's Party. I know people in the Green Party who are great that I've known before, and there are many different parties out there at the end of the day. And the Center for Political Innovation that I'm forming is not politically aligned with any of these parties. It is a think tank, and it's about putting forward policy solutions. It's about engaging in socialist education and putting forward policy solutions. Doesn't campaign for any candidate, and I'm not interested in competing. And that's one of the problems I think that happens is that there's a very competitive atmosphere. My party, my group is better than your group. I'm in charge of this group, so I'm better than this person that's in charge of the other group. I want to get away from that. I just want to educate people. I want to assemble and have an institution that can facilitate the conversations that need to happen to lay the basis for things actually improving in this country, because so many people were awakened. It seems like, between yourself and Jimmy Dore and Jackson Hinkle and so many of the great folks out there, the Bernie Sanders movement came, and there were a lot of people who said, okay, let's do it. Let's have a real left in this country. And then the Bernie Sanders movement went away, and now so many voices that were supportive of it have said, okay, we tried that. Now we're just going to move on. We're going to be regular. We're going to be regular Democrat. We're going to be regular Democrats now. Well, I would argue that now is the time to continue trying to build a real left in the United States. Now is the time to facilitate these conversations even more. And thank you for the correction, by the way. Inez Barron is in City Council. Charles Barron was in City Council for many years, but now he's in the New York State Assembly. That's correct.
Cool. I want to get your opinion about gentrification, since both of us are we live in cities that are really, really, really going through this and dealing with this as well. Oftentimes I continue to hear them say that we don't have enough housing for everyone. That's not true, obviously. We do have enough housing for everyone, but we do not have enough affordable housing. And it's been a big problem. I've watched neighborhoods here in Boston go from working class neighborhoods to now there's like juice bars on the corner and all the tech kids live there. So I've noticed it in New York too. When I went back to Brooklyn and I went to Williamsburg, and the first thing I said was, what happened to Williamsburg? This is not what it used to look like. So both of us are living in places where this has become a problem. And I honestly feel like if these cities do not get a handle on gentrification, eventually it is going to get to the point where it's going to be a city full of professionals and everybody else is going to be pushed so far out. The commute is going to be brutal, which some people are going through that now. But what do you think are some of the things that we can do to help fight back against gentrification?
Well, we first have to talk about what the root of the problem is. And the problem is this, that housing should be for people to live in. But under capitalism, it's not. Housing exists so that landlords and banks can make money off of it. And one of the ways they're making money off of it is through real estate speculation, right? If you own a building, in theory, the way you're supposed to make money is people renting apartments from that building, right? People rent there, you get their rent, you make profit from it. That's how it works. But thanks to Donald Trump and thanks to, the way the world has been shifting, real estate speculation is now the way a lot of these, property owners make money. They buy a building. They don't care if anybody lives in it or not. They buy the building and then they wait for the market to go up and then they sell it again. And it's just like gambling. It's just like the stock market. And they don't need people to actually live in the apartment building or in the house. They don't need them to actually live there in order to make a profit. It's turned into a gambling casino. And as a result, fewer and fewer people can be able to afford to live in places, and they can continue to make money. That supply and demand rule that's supposed to make capitalism so great is pretty clearly not working. It's not working, and as a result, in urban centers in the United States, the rents just keep rising and rising and rising. While the ability of people to continue living in these areas continues to decrease. And they're basically transitioning the urban centers of the United States into playgrounds for rich kids. They don't want people who happen to live there, who have a job there and have a family there. No, these are expensive playgrounds for the wealthy people, many of whom have an apartment in New York and have an apartment in Paris and have an apartment in Rio de Janeiro or wherever. And they go, there's this urban ultra rich cast that like to party. They do vanity art, right? It's so funny. I think about here in New York City, right? Greenwich Village. There's so many famous writers and painters and musicians who lived in Greenwich Village. Why? Because it used to be cheap, and they were starving artists, right? And they were living there. But now it's very, very, very expensive to live in Greenwich Village. Why? Because these ultra rich, cosmopolitan elites want to live there and pretend to be their favorite starving artist or their favorite famous and they want the experience, right, of producing vanity art and kind of play acting like they're Oscar Wilde or their F. Scott Fitzgerald or whoever. And it's this bizarre thing where it's like they're trying to relive the experience of being a starving artist, and they're paying lots of money for it. There's a level of like insanity there, right? I mean, but that's kind of what's going on here. And meanwhile, throughout the United States, the heartland of the United States is an economic state of decay. Property values in rural areas are plummeting. Suburbs are devastated, but the urban centers are increasingly becoming places that most people couldn't afford to live. And this is a problem. Now, what's interesting is Nicaragua. I have a good friend who recently went to Nicaragua. And in Nicaragua, they have a slogan, and it's painted, and they have it on billboards throughout rural areas. And it says, "Grow where you are planted." And they're making a big effort to make it so young folks in Nicaragua from rural areas don't have to move to the urban centers, which is happening all across Latin America, right? Is folks from the countryside move to the urban centers in order to survive. Well, because they associate that with, a lack of economic prosperity, with the country overall getting poorer, also with a lot of, problems they have with crime and drugs, et cetera. They are cultivating an atmosphere where younger folks in Nicaragua can grow where they are planted. They are bringing electricity to rural areas. They're bringing education to rural areas. They're building infrastructure. They're empowering the indigenous groups in these rural areas. And they're enabling it so that the cities don't turn into a place where people have to flee. They have to flee to as life becomes unlivable in the countryside. Look, like I said, I'm from Ohio, and I'm not the only person from Ohio who has moved to a coastal area. Many people I went to school with have moved to either California or New England because, the area that I grew up in a small town. It's where they make Smucker's jelly, Orville, Ohio. That's where I'm from. And there's not much there, economically since 2008, really, and especially since the pandemic. There's not much there in terms of economic opportunity. And so many people that I've grown up with have moved to urban areas and are now struggling to get by in urban centers. So there you go.
Dustin said, "What's with billionaires Gates and Buffett buying up all the farmland?"
Well, if we really want to know what they're about, we would have to ask them. But American agribusiness has long been a source of U.S. monopolies. There's a documentary called King Corn. It talks about how there's high fructose corn syrup in almost everything you buy. No matter what it is you buy, it's got high fructose corn syrup in it. Why is that? Well, corn grows in the United States, and corn is a huge center of the U.S. economy. And American agribusiness is a very key aspect of how the United States has dominated the world. Many countries around the world have had their domestic farming and agriculture kind of put out of business so that they can buy American food that's shipped in. After the fall of the Soviet Union, almost about 80% of the farms in Russia closed down, and they were importing their food from the United States. Now things have changed, and now Putin has actually rebooted the farming system of Russia. They're having the biggest harvest they've ever had. But in the 90s, Russia stopped growing its own food and had to basically import most of their food from Western Europe and from the United States. The people of Mexico have been growing their own food since long, thousands of years before Columbus ever showed up. They were growing their own food. But because of NAFTA, American agribusiness went into Mexico, put all the domestic farmers out of business, kicked them off their land, and now the people of Mexico are importing their food from Kraft and from American agribusiness giants. And the same thing's been done to Haiti. The same thing has been done to many developing countries. And American agriculture and agribusiness, corporations like Monsanto, this is how Wall Street keeps its grip on the world. They run the oil markets and they largely control agribusiness and the food markets. And the results have been quite negative. The food that the U.S. monopolies produce is not particularly good for you. Look at the rate of obesity in this country and such. But there you go.
Wow. I've always said, wouldn't it be great if companies like Google, Facebook, instead of moving to the coastal cities, which is where most of them are, if they move to some of the rural areas in the United States?
Absolutely. Well, one thing that I have argued, and is that, with climate change being such a serious issue, right? And the fact that fossil fuels cannot continue. I mean, it's just not sustainable to stay on fossil fuels. Fusion energy is really our best hope. We're not going to solve the problem of climate change with windmills. We're not going to solve it with solar panels. They're good, but they're not a solution. We need to get to a higher energy source, and that's fusion energy. And China is working very, very hard on fusion energy, and Russia is working very, very hard on it. And there are scientists here in the United States that are working hard on it. In India, they're working on it. What we need at this point is we need a new United Nations, a new UN international territory where all of the major institutions and countries and centers that are working on fusion energy combine their efforts into one. In the heartland of the United States, in Iowa or Kansas, we should build one gigantic international facility where all the scientists of the world can combine their efforts and be given the resources to solve the problem and get us fusion energy, right? And have fusion energy not be competitive, not have it, China trying to get it before Russia gets it, before the United States gets it, but instead have it be a unified effort. So when we get fusion energy, it's the property of all humanity combined. It's the property of all of us. It's not a competition. And that is the real solution to the problem of climate change. Anyone who tells you, the problem of climate change, we're going to solve it by everyone just having less or reducing consumption, degrowth, that's not a real solution. People want to have more than they already have. Too many people in this world are already in poverty. You're not going to degrow your way out of this problem. The only solution is to get higher, to get to a higher energy source, and that's fusion energy. And this is the real emergency of our times. We need to build Fusion City. Fusion City must be built in the heartland of the United States. We must build an international combined emergency effort, something like the Manhattan Project during World War II, where all of the scientists of the United States were concentrated in one space in Tennessee to make the atomic bomb. We need a global Manhattan Project, an emergency crash program for fusion energy. And there's no place better to do it than the heartland of the United States. It would bring the world together. It would get us out of the trap of fossil fuels, oil, and natural gas. It would get us beyond the problems of climate change. Fusion City must be built, and Fusion City is a policy solution that the Center for Political Innovation is developing. We're developing a formal proposal, and we want to start approaching people about it. Next time someone's raising the alarm about, climate change, are you for Fusion City or are you against it? It's a yes or no question. And Fusion City is the only real answer to the problem of climate change. The center of the United States has got a lot of wide open space where Fusion City could be built. And that is how we will get out of the disaster of fossil fuels. That is the real solution. And that's what we're putting forward at the Center for Political Innovation.
Wow. One more question for you, Caleb. You're educating everybody tonight. I'm like telling everybody, like, this is a free education for all of you. I've learned so much. But one more question for you. What do you see for the future 2024 election? What do you think is going to happen?
I have long studied the career of Kamala Harris. I wrote a book about Kamala Harris called Kamala Harris and the Future of America, in which I used Kamala Harris's life story and some insights into who Kamala Harris is to make some political points. My feeling is that Kamala Harris has been selected to be the president of the United States. Now, Tulsi Gabbard exposed her on the national debate stage for her horrendous record as a vicious prosecutor who who just went out of her way to keep people in jail, to feed the prison industrial complex, to try to keep innocent people on death row, to block evidence. I mean, her office was constantly being castigated by judges and others in California for the way it was treating people. She is somebody that a lot of Americans don't want in office. That said, and she got like less than 1% of the vote in the Democratic primary, but her very powerful friends were able to maneuver to get her into the vice presidency. And my feeling is that Joe Biden will probably step down before his 4-year term is up. I mean, we're already hearing it now with the senility and all of that. And I believe Kamala Harris will be brought into the presidency, that her powerful friends have maneuvered to try and get her behind our backs, to try and go around the public to get her into the presidency. And I think that it very likely will be Kamala Harris running against Donald Trump in the 2024 election. I think that's a very, very likely matchup. And I think there's a good chance that Donald Trump will win such an election, because Kamala Harris is not very likable. And they've been trying their hardest. I know with the K Hive, they've been trying their hardest to sell us Kamala Harris for years. People just don't care for her very much. She makes them uncomfortable. And if you look into her record, she's not the best person in the world, not the most trustworthy person in the world. But I believe that war lobby that had supported Hillary Clinton and was able to work with her during Obama's first term to really just foment chaos around the world. That faction, there was a meeting in Long Island and New York in the Hamptons where the folks who wanted Hillary Clinton to be the next president, they figured she couldn't run again in 2020. So they put their money and their resources behind Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is who they want. The American people didn't like Kamala Harris, so we got Joe Biden, and I think that she will be probably president before 4 years is up. If not, Joe Biden probably won't run again, and she'll be the nominee for the Democrats. That's my feeling.
Ouch. It's brutal, but it probably will happen.
Yeah, and I would urge folks to check out my book on Kamala Harris. It got some good reviews in newspapers all over the world. Newspapers in India quoted it in their publications. It was reviewed in many publications in Britain and elsewhere. And there's very little written about Kamala Harris. This is a woman who's very close to becoming president of the United States. She's got her official biography, and now there's been one other biography that's been published, but there's very little out there. When Barack Obama was running for president, they scrutinized every aspect of him, right? Barack Obama, he went to a Muslim school, and this was who his pastor was, and this is where he lived here, and he's from Hawaii, and his grandmother and his cousin. But Kamala Harris, it's just kind of like, yeah, she's vice president. Any more questions? She's from California. I mean, it's weird. They don't want us to dig into who she is. They don't want us to have a conversation about who she is. And I think that because if you look over her record, she is extremely dangerous. She is extremely dangerous. When she's on video laughing about how she locked up the parents of killed children that were truant from school, she's laughing about this. How does that benefit low-income children? To have their parents in jail because they skipped school, right? Kids need to be in school. You need to enforce that. But putting their parents in jail, that doesn't benefit anybody. But the craziest part is in the video where she's bragging about this. She's just got this gleeful look on her face about how she locked up parents. She starts talking about herself. And she said, I wouldn't be anywhere if it weren't for my education. What does it have to do with you? What does it have to do with her? Nothing to do with her. Her job as a prosecutor was to enforce the law. But it has everything to do with her. Kamala Harris is full of rage. She feels that the world has been unfair to her, that she has been mistreated in her life, and she probably did experience some extreme hardship. It's very clear that she and her father from Jamaica and her are enemies. They are not on speaking terms. He has denounced her presidential campaign. He called it a travesty of identity politics. He did not attend her inauguration as vice president. Her father, Donald Harris, who is a Marxist economist who lives in Jamaica, was a former professor at Stanford before he retired. He and her are not on speaking terms. They don't like each other. And it's pretty clear that Kamala Harris, she will talk at length about her mother, but her and her father are at odds with each other. And there seems to be some pain there. There seems to be, Kamala Harris very much feels that she has been mistreated, that the world has been unfair to her. And it seems like in her mind, there's a very strong desire to exact some kind of revenge. She takes pleasure in harming other people and has done so her entire life as a prosecutor when she just viciously tried to keep people in jail, tried to, conceal evidence. The way she gets excited about war. She very much feels that that the world needs to pay for how it treated Kamala Harris. In that debate with Joe Biden, she shouted, "That little girl was me." That's what Kamala Harris thinks. I mean, that little girl was her. Whatever happened to Kamala, we don't know what it was. We don't know what she experienced. We know some of the things about, being discriminated against in school and such. We don't know. We don't know exactly what happened, but the world has been unfair to Kamala Harris. That's pretty clear. And now she wants the world to pay for it. And I think we should do our best to make sure she doesn't get that opportunity.
Well said. Caleb, they already had T-shirts made of that little girl.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
little girl's me.
Right. It is very odd, I mean, of all the candidates in history, no candidate has ever talked about their own childhood as much as Kamala Harris, and it's very unhealthy. And it kind of reveals, I mean, you look at that clip on the Stephen Colbert show where she's asked about that little girl was me incident, right? She's asked about that, and she says, and she says, so you called Joe Biden, you essentially called Joe Biden racist, and now you're campaigning for him, and she just laughs and she says, "Oh, it was a debate. It was a debate. A debate? A debate? It was just a debate." I mean, like debates are how we determine who we're going to vote for. And she, "Oh, it was just a debate." Goodness gracious. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that means we probably shouldn't listen to anything she ever says, That's what that tells you. I mean, if some, I mean, did she say that, at the times where she was trying to keep evidence, to keep people in jail? Well, it was just a trial. It was just a trial. I mean, it's that the mindset there is very, very dangerous.
Agreed. All right, Caleb, where can people find you?
Well, my personal website is calebmaupin.com, CALEBMAUPIN.com. You can check out the Center for Political Innovation. We're at cpiusa.org. I'm on Twitter. I stream a lot on YouTube. I'm out there, and there's good folks doing good stuff. I view the work that you all are doing at Fred Hampton Leftists as so valuable and important. I'm inspired by everything that you're doing, and I'm inspired by so many voices. So many people are stepping up now and saying, we can't depend on the mainstream media to do it, so we're going to do it ourselves. And I think that's very inspiring. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to engage with your audience. Thank you for asking me good questions and giving me an opportunity to share what I know. It's really been an honor, and I deeply appreciate being on here.
Thanks so much for coming on, Caleb. You're doing great work.
Well, thank you. And you all are doing great work as well. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. You know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.